most famous transaction in baseball history happened on December 26, 1919. That's the day that Babe Ruth was sold to the New York Yankees. This wasn't just a big deal in hindsight. This was a huge story at the time. Passage of time tends to distort our memories. Babe Ruth was such a huge star in New York that people have eventually forgotten that he was actually also a huge star in Boston. Actually, from what I can tell, Babe Ruth was always a huge star, even going back to his early days with the Baltimore Orioles. Yeah, I'm talking about Jack Dunn's old Baltimore Orioles again. We need to turn the clock way back to 1914 for this one. 1914 was one of the most pivotal years in Major League Baseball history, and no, it's not because of World War I. It's because of the Federal League. We really have a hard time imagining today just how menacing the Federal League was. It's treated as a footnote in history. People like me who play OOTP, but who care a lot about baseball history, are really frustrated with the game for treating the Federal League like a minor league. It certainly was not a minor league. In fact, it did a very good job of stealing established players away from the established pro leagues. While I'm sure you've heard those old cliches about history repeating itself, in this case, it's absolutely right. The Federal League used the same model that the American League had used back in 1901. The idea was to stick teams in strategic locations to compete directly with major league and established minor league clubs. The owners planned to spend big at first to sign away as many stars players as possible. The baseball war would only end when the other two leagues went out of business or when a merger between the three leagues took place. Alright, I made a video just the other day about promotion and relegation systems and why baseball doesn't have one. If the Federal League had been successful, I'm convinced that we would have seen a promotion and relegation system in this country, even with geographic concerns and all the other stuff people have brought up. I mean, I just can't think of any other way that the three major leagues could have coexisted peacefully. But let me know what you think would have happened. It was in this tumultuous period for the sport that Jack Dunn signed Babe Ruth. Here it is, February 15th, 1914. This is the first mention of George Herman Ruth being signed by the Orioles. Now, did you get a chance to read that newspaper article? If not, go back, take a close look. Notice how the paper specifically mentioned that Ruth was a hard hitter. The Babe was 18 years old at the time, and most historians doubt that he ever left the city of Baltimore. I'm starting to believe that Babe Ruth was hitting line drives out of his bassinet. Now, back in those days, the Orioles took spring training. Ruth's first trip outside Baltimore, first trip ever, came with the ball club. They went down to Fayetteville, North Carolina. Like my friend Not Gaetti always says on Twitter, let that sink in, folks. Seriously, when we're talking about the old school minor leagues, you have to remember that these teams had their own spring training. The entire organization didn't go south together the way that they do today. The Orioles were completely independent. They would sign their own players depending upon what they could afford, and they went out to spring training alone. Let that sink in. Ruth hit a home run in his first spring training contest. The Orioles broke up into two teams that day, the Buzzards and the Sparrows. Ruth played for the Buzzards, starting at shortstop, believe it or not, before going in to pitch later on. His home run went far over the head of the right fielder, landing in a cornfield. Apparently there was no outfield wall. Reports had it that Jim Thorpe held the previous record for the longest ball hit in Fayetteville. And this was the first game of spring training. Sometimes we get these real romantic notions that great players start out quiet and inconspicuous. Actually, as I've studied baseball history, I've learned that that's never the case. Major league caliber ball players always show talent at an early age. And Babe Ruth? Well, George Ruth looked like one of the greatest hitters in history in his first spring training game. Oh, and he could pitch too. Ruth pitched a few innings against the Philadelphia Phillies on March 18th. He pitched fairly well, striking out 2 in 3 innings. He came on in relief the next day, stopping a Phillies rally for another Orioles victory. I said it before and I'll say it again. The Baltimore Orioles under Jack Dunn really should be considered a major league team. They were good enough to beat major league teams regularly in exhibition games. Just in case all that wasn't enough, consider what Ruth did against the world champion Philadelphia Athletics on March 25th. Ruth went the distance in the 6-2 victory, striking out 3 and winning the game despite giving up 13 hits. The more I learn about this, the more I can imagine how hard it must have been for Ruth to give up pitching. I mean, the guy was not a mediocre pitcher or an average pitcher. He was a great pitcher. He was a great pitcher at 18 years old. Ruth didn't pitch the first Orioles game of the season, by the way. That honor went to Dave Danforth. Despite his hitting ability, Ruth didn't start in the field either. The next day, April 22nd, was Ruth's first International League start. He shut out the Buffalo Bisons and went 2 for 4 at the plate with 2 singles. He was clearly a natural star, but there was trouble on the horizon. Only 200 fans showed up to that second game. Meanwhile, the Baltimore Terrapins of the Federal League were attracting large crowds, including scoreboard watchers outside the office of the Baltimore Sun. Alright, I flashed up an article a little while ago in this video about how Jack Dunn was not scared of the Federal League. Yeah, Jack Dunn should have been scared of the Federal League. He should have been frightened to death. You see, the Orioles were 100% dependent on gate receipts in 1914. That's just like every other baseball team in the United States. There was no merchandise, right? There was no selling like the hat with a logo on it or the shirt or the jersey or whatever. There were basically no baseball cards at the time. There were little pictures that they'd put in the newspaper sometime, but the old days of the tobacco cards were done and dead by 1914. This is a long time before there was television, let alone television rights. There was no radio in those days, let alone radio rights. And you know, it's not like the baseball teams would be paid by the newspapers for the newspapers to cover the games, right? The teams actually were dependent on the newspapers for advertising. All of this is to say that there were no real alternative avenues to revenue. Jack Dunn had to draw a large crowd to make money. If he couldn't, his only other recourse was to sell his stars to try to keep the club from going bankrupt. That, more than anything else, is the true significance of the Federal League. Now you know why the American and National Leagues hated the Federal League. This can also tell you why the National League decided to play dirty way back in 1902. That's when they raided the former American League Baltimore Orioles in the middle of the season. I mean, they didn't call this a baseball war for nothing. You see, the problem is that Jack Dunn simply could not attract paying customers no matter how good his team was. Baltimore simply could not support 2 major teams. By early July, rumors of player sales abounded. Bertie Cree was sold on July 7th to the Yankees. Cree, by the way, was a star for the Yankees in 1911, but never quite returned to that form. He had only just joined the Orioles at the beginning of 1914. The Reds bought 2 more players from Dunn the next day. On July 9th, the Orioles lost to Newark. They were still in first place, however, with a 48-26 record. Ruth started in left field that day. Ruth was also sold to the Boston Red Sox that very same day. The Red Sox bought Ruth, pitcher Eddie Shore, and Ben Egan. Egan had been the captain of the Orioles. Ben was traded a few weeks later to Cleveland before he could get into even a single game for the Red Sox. Ernie Shore started the first game of the World Series for the Red Sox in 1915, pitching against the famous Grover Cleveland Alexander. Though he lost that first game, Shore did win the 4th game of the series. Babe Ruth, of course, won Game 5. Well, there never was another player quite like Babe Ruth. Now, you can't do this research without realizing that. Great players have come and gone and will come and go in the future, but nobody, and I mean nobody in the history of the sport, has dominated all facets of the game the way that Ruth did. Now, for his part, Jack Dunn never forgot how he had to sell his stars for peanuts, and having to sell Ruth that way always irked him. Dunn wound up moving the Orioles to Richmond, Virginia in 1915. He only went back to Baltimore after the Federal League went bankrupt. And to his dying day, Dunn was extremely reluctant to sell the great players he collected. That paved the way for the great Orioles teams of the 1920s. It's crazy to think this, but if it weren't for the Federal League, Babe Ruth might have never pitched in the majors.